Hi there, everyone. I'm Deborah Cohen. I'm a history professor here at the university and the director of the Roberta Buffett Institute for Global Affairs. And it is such a pleasure to welcome you to this panel on the press, politics, and violence in Mexico. Um, we've got an amazing group of speakers here to discuss the innovations of Mexican journalism, the press, politics, as well as the really crucial issues of press freedom and safety. So I'm going to go ahead and introduce our speakers very briefly. For those of you who are still getting lunch, just please come and take a seat wherever you find them. And if there isn't room, we're always happy having people sitting on the floor, but I think there are spaces up here in the front as well. My colleague, Paul Gillingham, who is the author of this newly published book, Mexico, A History. As you can see, it's a very quick read. In fact, it is quite a quick read. Um, he is professor of history here at Northwestern. His book is The Justly Lauded Mexico, A 500-Year History, which Penguin published earlier this year. He also directs the Mexican Intelligence Digital Archives Project, which is an open access collection of papers from Mexico's security agencies. Javier Garza Ramos is a journalist who heads Horizonte Lagunero, a news platform on radio and social media in northern Mexico. When a newsroom he led came under fire from drug cartels, he developed safety protocols that are now used by newsrooms around the world that cover violence. His investigation of a school shooting in Torreon, 9 Shots, was published in 2020. In 2022, he received the Maria Moores Cabot Prize for Journalism in the Americas, given by Columbia University. Judith Matloff is a journalist and faculty member at Columbia's Graduate School of Journalism, where she teaches crisis reporting. She's written about international affairs for more than 4 decades. She's reported from Mexico as well as from Europe and Africa for Reuters. She also headed the Christian Science Monitors bureaus in Africa and as well as the Moscow Bureau. She writes for the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the Financial Times, among others. And the latest of her 4 books is the marvelous How to Drag a Body and Other Safety Tips You Hope to Never Need. I'm sorry I've left my copy at home, so I don't have one to show. Andrew Paxman is a research professor of history at the Center for Research and Teaching in Economics at CIDE in Mexico. He is the co-author of El Tigre, a biography of the media mogul Emilio Azcárraga Milmo, and the author of the biography Jenkins of Mexico. His new book is this terrific book, Mexican Watchdogs, on the press. You can see what he is doing here on the panel. The rise of a critical press since the 1980s. And he's currently working on a biography of former Mexican President López Obrador. So it's really a great pleasure to have you all. So what they're going to start, Paul is going to start off with a question for the panel, and then each of them will ask each other questions, and we'll sort of go from there. And then we'll leave some time for questions from the audience as well. So thank you so much to the audience for being here, and thank you so much for joining us.
Right. Well, if I could start off with a heartfelt thank you to Deborah for organizing this really excellent meeting of colleagues and friends. I feel particularly honored to be in the presence of not 1, but 4 really accomplished prose stylists. These people can really, really write almost as well as Deborah on a day. Extraordinary. And so I published this book, and it's not, I hope, too obvious a plug to say I'd like to ask how its final argument stacks up against people who actually observe current Mexico on a daily basis. And so the book's been sort of accused of being slightly second-hand nationalist and sunny-natured, because in the end it argued that, well, you know, Mexico, not really a victim that much of empires, because very successful actually in getting on with Mexicans' own thing during the colony, never called a colony, good at shooting emperors, which just not done, but Mexico does it. And then good really living on the doorstep of the US and telling them sort of systematically, well, yes, but no, the way very few other countries have. That was one. Secondly, the argument that while Mexico is subject to wrenching racism historically, it's also subject to an extraordinary degree of, by global standards, live and let live. And especially if you're in Mexico and you look north to Canada or the US, or you look east to British India. I tried to be equal opportunity rude in this book. And then really the subject of today, politics and violence, because again, it's seen that corruption and politics are synonymous, and violence and politics and the fabric of society are synonymous in Mexico. And I'd argue that Europe gave itself the Nobel Prize for Peace 70 years after World War II, because they'd managed not to kill each other for 70 years. And this was seen as a major achievement. And as soon as you zoom back from Mexican violence, you think, well, hold on, Americans and Europeans and Brits actually do fratricide much more convincingly over many more centuries. And so the book, having been, as I say, perhaps slightly sunny-natured, somebody said this is second-hand nationalism, about the broader threads of Mexican history, then said everything changed in 2006 with the war of choice against drugs, which led to cascading violence and all the other large amounts of collateral damage we've seen. I argue this is a rupture. This did not have to be. But with Andrew, Judith, Javier, I have people who actually know far more and far more close up about Mexico's last 20-year history of violence and the war on drugs and its effect on the press. And so my question to the three of you to start with is, do you really think that this is fair enough, that 2006 was a break from broader historical patterns in Mexico through your close-up and personal view as journalists and residents? And Javier, you're next to me.
Well, first of all, thank you, Deborah and the Institute, and thank you, Paul and Andrew, because we've been going over this for several years about having a conference like this. So I really appreciate the invitation. I think, you know, from what Paul said, 2006 is indeed a rupture in the sense that there is a new policy for taking on organized crime in a much more frontal way, but in a less strategic way. As the incoming government of Felipe Calderón 20 years ago shifts and starts fighting drug cartels all at the same time, it's really a shift in how Mexican government had been responding to drug trafficking. But it is also true that drug violence had preceded Calderón's arrival in power. Cartels were being more and more empowered, not to carry out widespread violence, because if we look at the preceding years, before 2006, there were actually some of the years with the lowest murder rate, homicide rate in Mexico. But cartels were getting more brazen in what they were doing to send messages of imposing themselves in a particular territory. We think of things that became familiar, like beheadings, bombs in nightclubs, executions in video. We had some of the first instances of all of that back in 2005, before Calderón came to government. So it was a turning point in the way that the government was responding, but it wasn't necessarily a turning point in the way that cartels were behaving. I think they were changing their ways into a more brazen, more open form of violence, less discreet than the one that they had been using in the 80s and the 90s, to draw less attention to themselves, because criminal groups were increasing in numbers, and they were all fighting for the same the same pie, right? The smaller shares of the same pie. So I would argue that, I mean, I don't know how things it would have turned out if there hadn't been that change of strategy in 2006. Maybe we would have experienced more violence, maybe less. It's really hard to tell, the counterfactual. However, in the sense of what also began that 2006, which was an increase in attacks on the press, and made the press much more vulnerable and prone to threats and attacks especially from the drug cartels. I don't think it really made that much of a difference. I think we're already begun the slide in a loss of press freedom that is not particular to Mexico. It's something that we've seen everywhere, global as internet and advances in technology, information technology, social media advance, we start getting information bubbles in which we start losing respect for press freedom or difference of opinions or something that when somebody has something different to say. And I think we would have gone that way regardless of whether there was violence or not, because people were resorting much more and more to violence, to silence journalists, to stifle dissent, to censor opinions, or to hide inconvenient facts or inconvenient truths. So I would say that we would have gone that way regardless of whether there had been a shift in violence against drug cartels, also because violence against journalists in Mexico doesn't come only from drug cartels. It comes from a host of different actions. And we have to look at the totality of that to understand that the moment that we're going through.
Judith, you've recently run a training program for crisis management risk assessment for journalists in Mexico. What's your take on that?
My relationship with Mexico is kind of 79 to 83, and then 2006 to 2013. And in terms of the violence against media, there's no question that there was just a tsunami of violence, that it was just a totally different landscape from when I first started out and then when I returned. And the fact that we needed to do so much intensive safety training as we started to do in 2006 up to now was just unheard of back in the early 80s and the late 70s. I mean, when there were political assassinations of journalists in the early 80s, it was just, what? I mean, it was shocking. And now it's sort of the everyday part of life of a journalist living there. So I would say that Calderon or not, when you look at the safety and the attacks on journalists, there's no question that it's just changed dramatically. And I don't know how you put the genie back in the bottle. I mean, I think it's just now become part of, again, the media landscape. And indeed, so many of the attacks against journalists also now are politically motivated. They're not necessarily from the cartels. And, how do you get to the root of that? So that would be my answer to the question.
Thank you, Paul. And I too would like to thank you, Deborah, and everyone for this spectacular event. Thank you so much for inviting us all. So I broadly agree with Javier that 2006 is a watershed moment, but it's a watershed moment that also has certain continuities with the past. So the homicide rate that Javier mentioned in Mexico, if you look from the 1930s all the way to 2007, the trend is generally down. And then it shoots up in 2008. And it's generally agreed that the reason for that repunte, that great change in the graph, you might say, acceleration in the homicide rate in general, which impacts journalists too, is not only the declaration of war on all of the drug cartels at the same time, which is quite different from how the government used to handle the cartels before. It used to go after one at a time, partly because it looked good to the gringos. We're jailing some capos, we're going after the Juarez cartel, or were going after the Gulf cartel, they tended to leave Sinaloa alone. And that changed with Calderon. He went after all of the cartels at the same time. So that was different. And what he employed was a strategy of mass containment. In other words, sending army as well as police into states where the problem seemed to be the worst. And coupled with what's called a kingpin strategy, where you take down, arrest, or kill capos. The problem with the kingpin strategy is twofold. First, in knocking off a cartel boss, you sometimes inadvertently produce a factional fight for succession within that cartel. We saw this again recently, a couple of years ago, when they extradited El Mayo Zambada, well, extradited him under false pretenses, in what was it, August 2024, I think. And that produced a knock-on effect in Sinaloa of a factional fight between the sons of El Chapo, Los Chapitos, and folk who'd been loyal to El Mayo Zambada. And the second problem is that when you take down a capo, rival cartels will sometimes perceive, these guys have been weakened, we can muscle in on their turf. So for both reasons, you get an uptick in violence. And that happened at a spectacular clip starting in 2008. So the first year of the Calderon presidency, 2007, the first full year of the presidency, it looked like the strategy was working. But over time, these side effects, you might say, started to ripple. And in terms of the effect on the press, this is really complicated because, as Judith said, a lot of the violence against the press has been political. But this is not a new thing. One of my sort of side projects in writing this book, Mexican Watchdogs, was to gauge attacks or assassinations, murders of journalists historically. So I built a database starting in 1879, going right up until 2024, the end of the López Obrador administration. And what you see is that in the Porfirian era, the dictatorship of Porfirio Diaz, 1876 to the Mexican Revolution, 2010, 2011, there were about 11 documented murders of journalists. And fully 5 of them were, the mastermind was the governor of a particular state. 3 others died in duels. They had insulted each other in the press, and they insisted on pistols at dawn. But five of these murders were carried out at the order of a governor. And in only one case did Porfirio Diaz, the president, remove the governor as punishment. So you have 2 precedents there. You have political violence against the press, and you have impunity. And that really sets the tone for the relationship between government and the press at the state level, right up until the present. And I say at the state level because my database also shows that 93, I think it is, % of murders of journalists have been carried out outside Mexico City, despite the fact that Mexico City represents, well, today something like 1/4 of the population of the country and has a vast concentration of media. It is journalists in the States who are typically at threat. And so what you have over the years, this dies down. The attacks on journalists really die down when the ruling party, the PRI, consolidates in the 1930s. And you find only 1 or 2 every sexennium, every 6-year term, only 1 or 2 journalists are bumped off. But in the 1970s, in the mid-1970s, as our colleague Ben Smith argues in his wonderful book, The Dope, The History of Drug Trafficking in Mexico, competing federal agencies muscle in on the turf of the Sinaloa cartel and compete for what is effectively an extortion racket. They insist that the drug cartels pay them protection money. This has been well documented. And as federal agencies compete for these protection rackets, that produces an upsurge in violence, and journalists who cotton on to this start to get killed. You know, they're exposing this corruption, or sometimes they're getting wind of this corruption and they try to extort. In one famous case, a correspondent for Excelsior, a major national newspaper, tried to extort a corrupt official and was bumped off in retaliation. But still, when Judith was working in Mexico in the late 70s, early 1980s, maybe 1 a year, 1 journalist a year was getting killed. After Calderon declares his war on drugs in 2006, the rate goes up to something like 12 or 13 a year. It's been climbing in the 80s and 90s, but it goes up to 12 or 13 a year under Calderon, and still today under Claudia Sheinbaum, and despite her rhetoric being less polemical towards the press than that of López Obrador. In 2025, 7 journalists were killed, which was the same average number as under López Obrador.
So you see, you invite a historian to talk about 2010, 2020, and you end up in 1870.
My apologies.
It's an occupational problem. I would note that, how do you deal with the fact you talk about press repression under Porfirio Diaz, the great late 19th, early 20th century dictator? And criticism of the time says, look at how dictatorial he is. One journalist, Filomeno Mata, has been sent to jail 39 times. A cynic immediately says that means he got out at least 38 times, and proper press killers, that just doesn't happen. Though, really, you think that you've got that long-term murderous repression? It's just a question of how much the volume is turned up or down?
Yeah, I think that the relationship between state governors and the press is always repressive, but it's a combination of stick and carrot. And under the hegemony of the PRI from the late 1920s until the early 1990s, or this gets complicated by the drug factor starting in the late 70s. State governors and state officials tend to prefer the carrot. In other words, bribes and subsidies to local media. And in other words, it's easier to buy off than bump off, you might say. And that's what they do. Most journalists working in the States are either directly or indirectly on the payroll of the government. And that's true in Mexico City too. So in other words, there doesn't need to be that much violence against the press because they're mostly most journalists are in the pocket of the authorities. Now, there are a couple of exceptions. Our colleague Ben Smith, who I mentioned earlier, wrote a great book, which is almost a kind of a prequel to mine called The Mexican Press, and it goes from 1940 to 1976. And he found that there was a case in Baja California in 1956 when a particular governor, Braulio Maldonado, I think his name was, bumped off 2 journalists in a year. And he was not, he did so with impunity. And this kind of sent the fact that the president allowed him to get away with this sent a kind of an implicit signal to other regional authorities that, journalists, you could probably get away with killing a journalist. And so over the next 5 years, another 6 or 7 are killed. It's a sort of minor blip in this, it's a blip in this continuity of generally peaceful relations between the late 20s and the 1970s. So yes, I think it's a constant.
Judith, Javier, you've both seen that there's a huge division between the risks associated with being a national reporter, who are relatively protected, and being a provincial reporter, quite often the first step in a story. And there's this chasm in risk, isn't there?
I'm very lucky because I'm not Mexican. And also the vast majority of the foreign reporters are based in Mexico City. And the violence, to my knowledge, I mean, there was a fellow from Veracruz, I think Proceso, who was, if I'm not mistaken, who was targeted a few years back in DF in the capital. But for the most part, you're pretty insulated and safe there. And with the safety training that I was doing with journalists, it was all provincial. We didn't need to do it in Mexico City. It was all, the most vulnerable people were in the provinces, as I'm sure you've seen yourself.
I think Andrew touched on something that's important. It's impunity in general and in crimes against journalists in particular, because it's really the fuel that keeps feeding successive crimes. I'm just going to tell you a very quick story about Andrew's compadre, a guy named David Lunau, who used to be the bureau chief in Mexico City bureau chief for the Wall Street Journal. And back in 2010, when Torreon, the city where I live in northern Mexico, was under fire, we had about 800 homicides that year in a turf war between the Zetas and the Sinaloa cartel. David comes to Torreon to do a story, and he calls me up, and we meet. I talk to him a bit about what's going on, and I put him in touch with a few people, the chief of police, a couple of businessmen here and there. And the next day, I take off on a trip. And as I'm landing the afternoon of the next day, I get a call on my cell phone from one of David's colleagues in the Wall Street Journal bureau in Mexico City, and Jose de Cordova, great reporter. And he says, sorry to bother you, but have you heard from David? And I said, no, why? And he said, well, because it's been a couple of hours since he hasn't reported in, and our policy when a reporter travels somewhere in Mexico is that, they should call in every hour or so, just to make sure that we're okay. And we trying to reach him, but his phone goes to voicemail. And my first thought, because, been scolded a few times we have been attacked, we have been threatened, our city was basically on fire, and the authorities didn't seem to be doing anything. It was, I just picture the next day's headline, right? American reporter kidnapped by the Zetas or Narcos or whatever. And it was, well, first of all, because I really like David, and it would be a shame if anything happened to him. Second, because it would put my city under a very negative light, a hellhole, basically. But third, there was like a thing that gave me a little hope. It's like thinking, well, if what's needed is that the Zetas kidnap an American reporter for the government to get off their asses and do something, then maybe this would be a good thing. I mean, I didn't really think that seriously, but thought just crossed my mind. Eventually, it turned out that David had just ran out of battery and gave everybody a pretty good scare. But that was our mindset in those days. And there's always a tier. The most vulnerable journalists in Mexico are the local reporters, right? They're the ones who are getting the attacks, mostly threats. They're getting killed, they're getting kidnapped, they're getting beaten. Reporters in Mexico City usually don't. As your level of prominence rises, your risk decreases a little bit. It's the political cost for a criminal group or for a politician in harming a journalist increases as that journalist is more prominent. Although it's not always the case, as we saw with the killing of Javier Valdez in Sinaloa, who was a local reporter, but he had international prominence, one of the better known Mexican journalists outside of Mexico, especially because of the way he was covering the drug war from Sinaloa. Fearless guy, great guy, and pretty much universally liked by everyone in Mexico and abroad. And his murder really had an impact. But that was more like an outlier. It was more like an exception to the case. And of course, the ones that would never be harmed, because that would bring, serious repercussions were foreign correspondents, especially from the most prominent news outlets. So there is always this categorization. But we also have to remember that even though outside of Mexico, it seems that organized crime, drug cartels are the main predators of the press in Mexico, are the ones that are carrying the most attacks. It's really not the case. According to the reports on attacks against the media, so the most trustworthy are done by Article 19. They're the most exhaustive. It's about 30% of attacks against the media, the press, against journalists are attributed to organized crime. But the reason that they resonate more broadly outside of Mexico is that they are the most violent. They are the ones who usually kill the journalists or attack the offices or kidnap or beat. Most of the attacks are carried out by politicians or public officials, including security forces, mostly local police. But that's usually threats, surveillance, harassment, not necessarily physical violence as the cartels. That's why they don't resonate so much. Also because they don't get reported as often. But they're still there. And I think that's also part of what's been going on in Mexico as the loss of a culture for respect of freedom of the press that I was talking about has been decreasing. Politicians feel with more liberty to threaten a journalist or to harass a journalist. I think also from López Obrador during his government, when he had this morning press conference in which he railed against the press, left and right, everywhere, everybody, calling them jackals and corrupt and conservative or whatever. I think that gave permission to everybody in the lower levels. If a small-time mayor would say, well, if the president does it, then I'm going to do it. Nothing's going to happen to me. It's a free-for-all. And I think that's also been one of the most negative consequences for the media in recent times, because we not only have to contend with organized crime, we not only have to contend with security forces, we also have to contend with politicians that are getting more and more brazen in the ways that they antagonize the media.
Of course, Javier Valdez, if I remember, was actually more scared of Sinaloa's politicians than of Sinaloa's narcos.
Yeah, I think Javier was probably more scared of the politicians, even though it was a narco that killed him. But he used to think that he was pretty safe from the narcos because he said that he was fair to everyone.
And if you start killing sort of provincial journalists, do you think it's fair to say that in Mexico, more than many sort of middle-income countries, the national press really relies on provincial journalists and stringers, and that the main national papers don't actually have as much a provincial presence as they rely on taking provincial stories and then sort of moving them up the food chain? Is that fair?
I think it's always been that way, in that local journalists, maybe working for a local news organizations, some of them usually freelanced for a Mexico City-based newspaper who couldn't afford a network of correspondents. Very few papers in Mexico City had a network of correspondents who worked for them full-time. So they did a lot of stringing. It also reflects how precarious the job situation is for Mexican reporters, especially outside Mexico City. When they had to have 2 or 3 jobs, stringing for other outlets, but there weren't all of them. Just a few of them were the most renowned. But in any case, Mexico City, the press based in Mexico City only looked to other cities when there were mostly episodes of violence. They don't really cover the rest of the country like a place where everything is going on, not just the violence. There are political developments, economic developments, sports, entertainment, culture. They don't really look at the whole picture.
To me, to see the parallels of Mexico and the United States, because although, of course, our media landscape is not as dramatic and as horrifying as it is in Mexico, I feel like we're moving more towards that model as the decimation of the media, particularly the local media in this country. I mean, since I returned to the States 26 years ago, I think 80,000 jobs have been lost in media, if not even 100,000. And local radio stations have closed down, local newspapers have closed down, national newspapers have closed down. And the situation for local journalists has become ever more precarious. And I think also the budgets have been stretched for national newspapers. I mean, look at what happened with the Washington Post. And so their coverage of the periphery likewise has shrunk because they just don't have the resources to do it. So hopefully we haven't gotten to the point where journalists are going to be killed here, but we certainly have a situation where for local journalists, it's a far more precarious livelihood. And the thing about local journalists in this country is that they're really open to attacks more than national journalists. You have local militias, you have local politicians, you have local police who are attacking them. verbally at least. Any rate, just a little aside there.
Andrew, your book's called Mexican Watchdogs. How much are those watchdogs rooted in regional journalism as opposed to national organizations?
Well, there are a couple of media, as Javier said, there's a long tradition of national media employing on a freelance basis reporters based in the States who are working for local newspapers as their correspondents. Proceso, which for decades has been the main national news magazine, had an impressive network of correspondents around the country, and Reforma, the newspaper that launched in Mexico City in the mid-90s, also did so. But both have cut back considerably as of about 10, 15 years ago, and now have very few. And there are a number of reasons for this. One is financial, obviously the flight of readers and advertisers to the internet, which I think, I've read that the tipping point here in the United States was 2005. Oh, you think it was before? Perhaps I'm referring to the New York Times. Yeah. In Mexico, it was 2009. So in 2009 was the year when advertising spend on legacy media began to decline. And it was partly because of the crash of that year, the recession, but it never recovered. And so newspapers began to lay off journalists. They began to thin the number of pages. And the very next year, 2010, and compounding this problem, was a change in the labor law in Mexico. So under the Calderon government, the labor law was changed to make it much easier to hire and fire employees across the board. I mean, in all sectors. It was felt that for too long, labor laws had been so rigid that it was really, really hard to lay off workers without massive compensation packages, and this was detrimental to Mexican industry in general. So the law was changed, and the effect it had on journalism was that major national newspapers like El Universal started employing journalists. The expression in Spanish is de honorarios, as opposed to having a set salary. You'd be employed on a piecemeal basis without a contract, without health benefits and all the rest of it. And so as that model multiplies, journalists are they're seeking second income streams or third income streams. They're freelancing more on the side. Now, the more you do that, the more risks you're likely to take. And I think this is another factor, particularly in the States. I've heard of photojournalists that have been paid, we'll pay you 50 pesos per dead body that you photograph. And so imagine if you're riding around, I don't know, on the outskirts of Acapulco, which is a major homicide hotspot and area of contest between competing cartels. And you're going from one crime scene to another, taking out a camera and taking pictures, and you're taking as many pictures as possible because that's your livelihood. Well, yeah, and you're probably quite tired by the end of the day. Your judgment may be getting a little impaired. You go to a crime scene, you hear on, you're tuning into police radio, and you hear about some shootout, and you arrive, and it turns out the shootout is still taking place, or there are still gunmen in the area. There have been journalists who have been shot because of that. So I think this has contributed to the homicide rate in the States, the fact that people are taking greater risks. Now, that was particularly the case under Calderon, when the homicide rate was just spiraling. About 80 journalists were killed during that 6-year period from 2006 to 2012. In the next presidential term, under Enrique Peña Nieto, the number fell to about 48. And I think that's partly because, despite these factors that I've been talking about, assignment editors started taking a lot greater care over their reporters and saying, don't go out there, or don't go out there on your own. Or in some cases, and this is a subject I think we've only briefly touched upon, the media decided we're not going to cover narco violence anymore. We're just not going to write about it. And so what emerged were so-called zonas de silencio, so zones of silence, areas of the country like at the border of Tamaulipas, the Tierra Caliente in Michoacán, where local press simply stopped writing about violence because it was just too dangerous. You didn't know who you were going to piss off. So that's a part of the equation too.
Say something about the Sounds of Silence, which is in several parts in Mexico, not always the same parts, just kind of moves around. But one of the measures that many newsrooms took for covering violence, because they wanted to protect journalists into not saying any more than they should, is that they would say, well, we're just going to rely on the press release from the police or the states, the state attorney general, which in Mexico is the one that handles criminal investigations. And, you know, whatever they put out in the release, that's what we're going to publish, right? The logic was that in many cases, the state attorney general is controlled by the criminals who are doing the killing, right? So whatever they put out in the statement is going to be what the criminals want. And so everybody's happy because nothing is going to get published that the criminals don't want. It's kind of like a twisted logic, but it was made to safeguard the reporters who were covering that. But what some state attorneys general discovered was that if, you know, the media is going to go out with our press release and we don't put out a press release, then they're going to go out with nothing. And so things started happening that didn't happen because there was no press release. That happened for a while. It's still going on in some cases, you know, things that don't get reported, but people know they happen, right? It's getting harder and harder to sustain that because of social media. A lot of people on social media anonymously go out and say, why nobody's talking about this dead body, you know, that turned out on the street, or this shootout that happened. It's getting hard to cover it up, but it was a way that was getting covered up. At least when it comes to reporting violence, journalists take their cues from authorities increasingly and do very little to non-existent original reporting. That's not for being lazy. That's basically for self-protection. You know, it's a self-preservation instinct. I mean, I would admit, I've told this story very few times before, but it bears maybe right now. We can resort to some pretty difficult ethical decisions when covering crime, because our calculation is not only informing, it's protecting ourselves, right? So in one time when I was editor of El Siglo de Torreón, I don't know if you've heard of the narcomanta. The narcomantas are banners that criminals hang on overpasses or bridges or pedestrian bridges with messages, usually threatening messages against authorities. Our policy was not to report the message. Our policy was just to report there was a banner that came out in the bridge at so-and-so avenue at 10 in the morning. It threatened local officials, and it was taken down at noon, right? That was it. But then one day, some criminals put one up, and they called our newsroom, and they said, we want you to publish what the message says. And we didn't do that, right? I talked to my counterpart in our competition, another newspaper, Millennium, and, you know, she and I had the same policy because we had agreed on the same policy. And so she said, no, we're going to go standard, you know, like we always do. Okay. So the next morning, call comes in our newsroom, and a guy says, we are going to put the banner back up, and you are going to report what it says, right? And that's, you know, where we thought, you know, maybe we should take this seriously. So I called my counterpart and says, what do we do? And she says, well, let's go another day, you know, just standard, and let's see what happens. So we did that. And the next day, another call, and they said, we are going to put the banner up again, and you are going to report what it says. So at that time, I called a contact in the federal government, the federal police, and I said, you know, this is going on, right? This is happening, and we don't know what to do. We don't want to publish the message, you know, because our policy is not to be mouthpieces for criminals. And he already knew what the narcomanta said. He already knew some of the names of the officials that were mentioned. There were some state police commanders that were alleged by this criminal group to be corrupt or working for another criminal group. And he says, here's what we're going to do. He says, we are going to make up a press release. And we are going to say that we are opening up an investigation against these guys. You print the press release. There is no investigation. There is nothing. But you print the press release, and maybe that's going to calm them down. So that's pretty much what we did. They made up the press release. We printed the press release. The bad guys saw it, and that was it. Right? It's just I can't tell that story without thinking, what are you doing? Right? I mean, this is something that would fail anybody. That would just, it wouldn't get me a job anywhere if I actually told this story, right? But when your calculation starts to save someone, is to protect your newsroom, to protect reporters, then yeah, you make up a press release and you print it, right? That's it's embarrassing, it is, but I haven't found anybody who would tell me they would have done it differently.
Your building was shot at once, is that right?
5 times, yeah. Yeah, so yeah, and this was after the 5th time they was shot at, so we weren't really not in the mood to test the waters again.
I think what your newsroom did is accepted safety policy around the world. I mean, Russian journalists, most of the independent Russian journalists have left the country. And they too had the same sort of calculations of what do we actually report. But ultimately, as a newsroom, you have to protect your staff, even if it means self-censorship or taking these kind of circuitous routes. But I don't think anybody in the industry would look at you and say that you were unethical.
Yeah, I think it's very, I think we really have to empathize with Mexican editors and publishers. I remember when a particular newspaper on the border published a front page story. It was a front page editorial directed at the local narcos. And the headline was, "What do you want from us?" Because they'd had several journalists, I think 3 journalists killed at that paper over the previous 3 or 4 years. And this editorial made headlines. A number of international media, New York Times, Toronto Globe and Mail, Guardian, I think, picked up on it. And the judgments varied. The New York Times, I think, was quite sympathetic, said, you have to put this in context. If papers such as this decide that they're not going to cover violence anymore, then we have to respect that judgment, and we have to be more demanding of the federal authorities in Mexico that they provide greater protections to the press. The Globe and Mail was critical of that editorial, but I think it's very hard to make, or perhaps we should be hesitant to make moral judgments without knowing the full picture.
I wouldn't make a moral judgment for a second. I would ask, though, incentives to continue doing serious, dangerous provincial journalism. I was made to think about this question, not rhetorically, but seriously, in the context of what's probably the biggest news story out of Mexico this year, which was the death of 2 CIA operatives in a car crash with Mexican officials after having busted 6 major labs. And that went down, at least in the outside world, as being a New York Times scoop. But if I have it right, it was actually based on a state reporter in Chihuahua, Luis Chaparro. What is in it for him? Is there a career path whereby a major scoop like that lands you a job in Reforma, or is this just proceeding?
Before I answer that, let me just add a point to something that Andrew was saying about that editorial that came out in Diario de Juárez in September of 2010, after a second journalist from El Diario was killed, a photographer. The question, when they say, "What do you want from us?" was addressed to the Cartel de Juárez and the Cartel de Sinaloa, who were fighting a turf war there. But it said, "We are addressing you because you are the true authorities here. We are not addressing the government because the government is not functioning anymore. You guys are the ones calling the shots, so we are talking to you. What do you want from us?" That was the tone of the editorial, and it was that, I think that was the most striking part. because that was something that we all felt. You know, we never felt protected by the government, right? So part of the reason that we were taking safety measures was because we knew that the government wasn't going to come out and help us. So I think that was the most compelling part was, you know, we are talking to you because you are the true government in Ciudad Juarez. And it just gave you the idea of how much criminal structures had penetrated political structures. Now, going back to this point, yeah, this thing that happened in Chihuahua is you know, blowing up all kinds of things in Mexico, especially with regards to how far is the United States government acting in Mexico to fight drug cartels and drug trafficking. And it's always been that case. The only reason that we knew that there were 2 CIA officers working in Chihuahua was because they died in a car crash. If there hadn't been no car crash, we never would have found out. It happens at a moment when the federal government has some pretty strong rhetoric against United States participation, against United States sending agents. It's also a bit of a response to Trump, you know, saying every now and then that he wants to invade Mexico and that President Sheinbaum won't let him send troops, even though he's asked. You know, there are still some pretty strong nationalist sentiments in Mexico. And while there are circles that say, yeah, let the U.S. send us the Marines and be done with it, you know, there are other people who think that's going to make things worse, and that's probably what's going to happen. I think that's going to make things worse. But you know, the fact that a state government was caught having foreign agents in anti-narcotics operations without the knowledge of the federal government, that was the big thing. Now, we've learned a lot about that from reporting, more than from the official investigations, but the reporting has been from foreign respondents. It's been mostly from the Washington Post and the New York Times, and the best scoops have come from a freelancer named Steve Fisher, who writes for the Wall Street Journal and the LA Times. Luis Chaparro is more like a freelancer. I wouldn't call him a reporter in the strict sense. You know, he's more like a commentator, but he has pretty good sources. I'm still not sure exactly where he writes or where he lets, you know, he has a podcast, but he hasn't doesn't have an established presence in traditional media. So people still tend to be pretty skeptical of the new formats. There's still some, you know, if it shows up in the LA Times or the New York Times, that has more authority. If it's just a guy with a random podcast, then who knows if. But that's increasingly where people are also turning for news, right? It's alternative sources. You have to make sure, and this is a key, you know, critical part of what's called media literacy. You know, how people discern and distinguish the sources of information that they are going to have so that they don't fall into rabbit holes or information silos or bubbles, you know, where they just hear what they want to hear or learn what they want to learn, right? Fragmentation of the media is causing that.
Of what motivates people, for sure, there are people in the media, either traditional or non-traditional, who are in it as, you know, for career advancement. But I would say, by and large, most journalists and photojournalists and documentary filmmakers are in it because we're mission-driven. You know, we're observers. We're usually very politically astute. We usually have a very strong, compassionate, humanistic drive. And most journalists will go to ridiculous extremes for ridiculously little money because they feel that they're serving society. And I would say that, you know, it's interesting. I mean, I've worked in 65 different countries, and whenever I meet journalists in any other country, there's a sense of intense connection because of that mission drive. And I don't know if other professions have that, maybe emergency health people, but it is I guess, an industry standard generally. The journalists go into this because they see themselves as human soldiers for society.
That's right. And
civil society.
And many of them at the local level are not trained journalists. They're taxi drivers, or they have any kind of job, but they feel passionate about, for example, corruption at the local level, and so they put up a Facebook page and they report. And this, of course, prompts a whole new set of problems when they in turn become victims of violence, because it then becomes easy for the state governor to say, oh, he's not really a journalist. He's not a real journalist. He's a taxi driver with a Facebook page. Well, yes, but he is holding power to account. So therefore, he deserves protections. That's a whole new area of debate. But that's just a brief answer, because I do want to leave time for audience questions.
Thank you to all the panelists. Ed Westerman is my name. I'm with the History Department. I've got an observation and a question for you. The observation is the fact that the Mexican government hasn't been able, over its history, whether we look at the 19th century, to execute central control over the outlying provinces, whether it's Sonora, Chihuahua. I mean, you know, Lance Blythe talks about Janos as community of violence. Brian DeLay talks about this lack of central government control. So how much does that impact this longer trajectory of structural problems? And for the second thing, with the discussion of Russian journalists who are outside the country now reporting. So to coin a phrase, maybe we have a diasporic press. So in the United States, I would argue, I came from Texas, San Antonio. So there's a diasporic press that's interested in the border, El Paso, McAllen, and other places. So is that one of the ways to get beyond this kind of traditional established media presence, to kind of look at it from those perspectives to cover some of the blank spots?
Second question. What we are seeing increasingly over the past 10 years are cross-border, and not just American, North American cross-border, but we're seeing more international consortiums of investigations. You look at the Panama Papers, you look at the WikiLeaks, so increasingly what we're seeing is people from different countries are working on projects together, usually investigations, and there's been an explosion in that. And one reason why is for safety reasons. If the Guardian is publishing with a local newspaper, I worked on, for instance, an investigation out of Nevada, and what I did is my magazine collaborated with the Guardian to give me legal cover. So we're seeing increasingly that in the media landscape.
And to talk about centralization, which is one of the old questions in Mexican history, how on earth does this stack up? It's a very good question, which we're still all trying to get to grips with. But for any libertarians in the audience, I'm guessing there probably aren't many, but Mexico in some reasons has stuck together because of enforcedly hands-off, in sometimes weak government. And this goes back hundreds of years. There's this wholly wrong historical interpretation of this massively centralized, sort of sophisticated imperial presidency under a one-party state. And that one-party state lasts 71 years. And you sort of nod and think, wow, they must have been doing something right. What they were doing right in part was just bowing to the inevitable and not trying to flex too many central muscles. Sort of, you could translate it into Spanish or Latin, just keep the lid on, and you'd have a fairly good guide to 500 years of successful Mexican survival of a central government without much central power.
I'd say about centralization first, and the structures that move politics in Mexico. It's true that there's a history of weak governments, but not of weak political projects. Political projects tend to be very, very strong, and they tend to be centrifugal in that they attract and have things spinning around them, including the media. For several times throughout our history, media has had to try to break from that. And in some ways, or in some quarters, it has been successful. But I thought about this back years ago when López Obrador came to power, when thinking about what he calls the fourth transformation. I don't know if you've heard this term. López Obrador had the idea that his government would bring about the country's fourth historical transformation, because the three greatest had been the independence, the Reforma wars, which was our sort of like our civil war, except it was over religion and not race or slavery, and the Mexican Revolution of the early 20th century. So he thought of himself in such grandiose terms that his arrival was the fourth transformation. And I thought about, how the press, what kind of press did Mexico had in the previous historical moments that the other transformations, which were actually transformations, they were historical transformations, in that the country was totally different afterwards than it was before. There wasn't much media in 1810 when the independence, but modern Mexican media was born around the mid-19th century. And if you want to put it in historical terms, we can put it in American terms, for example. During the Civil War, there was Confederate media and there was a pro-union media. Media, journalists, newspapers mostly had a party. They were usually instruments of one faction or the other. The whole idea of objective reporting wasn't born until much later, end of the 19th century, early 20th century. During the Mexican Revolution in Mexico, you had newspapers that supported Porfirio Díaz's dictatorship or that supported the anti-re-election movement of Francisco y Madero. And during the Reform Wars, you had newspapers that supported the conservatives who wanted the Catholic Church to maintain a stronghold in government, or that supported the liberals who wanted a separation of church and state. Mexican journalism detached from that model and began to a tradition of more independent reporting or objective reporting. Even though there was a lot of political control, you could still see, that they were not there to support a cause. López Obrador and his movement, Morena, they want to return to that model in which the media is supposed to support a political project. I sense that that's something that's going on in other parts of the country. I think that's what we saw in Hungary, right, with Orbán. Orbán wanted the media to support his political project. Trump wants the whole media to support his political project, and anybody who doesn't do that are horrible people, as he says. That's a trend that's going on everywhere, and so I think that's one of the things that also in Mexico we have to contend now, along with all of the other problems.
I just want to push back slightly on what Paul said about the sort of liberal attitude towards the states, and part of the success of the PRI being allowing the states to do what they want. I mean, to a point, yes, but there's also a device that the government, federal government, has, that's written into the Constitution, which allows the Senate to disappear, is the word they use, powers within the states if it so chooses. And because the PRI always had a majority in the Senate up until it was voted out of office in the year 2000, this presented a kind of a sword of Damocles hanging over the heads of state governors. They knew that if they were too naughty, or if they were too corrupt, or if they let violence spiral out of control in their states, or if they allowed a prominent journalist to be bumped off with impunity, the president might remove them. And dozens of state governors were removed between the 1920s and the 1990s. One in Tamaulipas was removed after his chief of police bumped off a prominent newspaper publisher. So there's that. Now that system ceases to function in 2000, because when the PAN threw the PRI out of office in the year 2000, this is a right-of-center opposition party. They were elected with President Fox in 2000, but they didn't control the Senate. So that mechanism ceased to function. It ceased to function until Morena came in 2018. And so this is one of a number of factors that give governors license around that time, as of around 2000, to kind of do what they want, to become sort of petty dictators in their states. They also have vastly increased budgets due to a tax reform in 1998. And I think part of the uptick in murders within the states as of 2000 owes to this new sense among governors that we can really do what we like and no one's going to get rid of us. So there's a problem there.
Never ever pick an argument with somebody who's actually written a book about this, but Andrew hasn't. He just edited it. And so I would push back against the pushback, saying that this was a really useful sort of Damocles, agreed, but it's used very little after 1952 until 1988, when Salinas comes back. And it almost charts actually a failure of national politics. Failure in what way? Well, sort of to keep the lid on. And so while I agree it is this fantastic mechanism of control, it's actually from 1952 through to 88 used surprisingly infrequently. And that's in part, I think, because it works. But that's also, I think, in part stability, meaning stepping back, in part because you can, but in part because you don't really want to meddle with a local governor unless they're clearly totally out of line and killing a Christian Democrat newspaper editors.
Okay, yes, we have one from Zoom from Anna. Thank you so much for this discussion. You mentioned that the press is targeted by both cartels and political officials. You described how the respective networks of these actors converge to commit acts of violence against the press. I'm wondering if you can say more about the racial, class, and gendered aspects of violence against journalists that manifest in these networks. How does violence against the press exacerbate ongoing inequalities in Mexico?
Okay.
Hi, my name is Jose, and I'm a sophomore here. And my question is, it's no secret that right now Mexico's undergoing a period of democratic erosion. And we talked a lot about the press at the local level and how dangerous it is. And I was just wondering, right now in this context of democratic erosion, are you more concerned for the nationalized press and the threats it's facing, and it's really backstop to this backsliding, or is your concern more at the local level of the safeguards that it can to kind of prevent this further backsliding in the role it plays? So
let me just briefly answer on the gender issue. In my database of 350 murdered journalists from the 1870s to the near present, about 6% have been women. So it's really, not usual for female journalists to be killed. The first one was killed in the 1980s, and but there have been some high-profile killings of female journalists just in the last 10 years. Miroslava Breach in Chihuahua and Regina Martinez in Veracruz are the best-known examples. So women are no longer off limits. There might have been a sense once that women were off limits. That's no longer the case.
Then in recent years.
About the second question about the clampdown on media from whether it's national press or local press, so that was the idea, right? I think it's pretty much uniform now because Morena has advanced in its control of government institutions at every level now, because they have I don't know what 25 or 26 governorships, mayor's office in some of the biggest cities, and of course the federal government. They can exercise control, particularly through government advertisement, right? So now threats or intimidation are not necessarily required when all you can do is just turn off the spigot for government advertisement, which has always been a means of control in Mexico, except that when the PRI had this same level of dominance over the country's political landscape, the press had other means of being independent because there was commercial advertisement back in the 60s and the 70s and the 80s. So many, for example, many local newspapers could, pretty well be critical of the local government. And if the governor and the mayor got angry and they said, well, we're going to take out our government advertising, that used to be 10% or 15% of their income. So it didn't really matter. Now it's different. Now, as the business model changed and government advertisement is what sustains most news organizations, it's pretty easy for the government structures to exert a degree of influence that they would otherwise have to get through intimidation or harassment or violence. So it's become much more subtle.
There is a solution, and it's a solution that I think Mexico could adopt from smaller countries in Western Europe. Back in the late 60s and early 70s, Norway and the Netherlands both realized that it was good for democracy at the local level for there to be a subsidy mechanism, a federal subsidy for print media in the smaller towns that were having difficulty sustaining newspapers with the advent of television. And so they set up funds, federal funds, that would subsidize the local press. This is now common in Western Europe. I think pretty much every country except Germany and the UK have these funds in Western Europe. So in Spain, for example, they're used to subsidize Basque language or Catalan language newspapers. We could have this in Mexico. We could have an institute that is protected against or set up with an autonomous structure where politicians are not allowed to interfere. The problem historically in Mexico is that the arbiters of subsidy money have tended to give that money according to the political position of the media. If you're nice to the government will reward you with massive ad spend, and if you're critical of the government, it will take that spend away. And this is what has happened even more nakedly than before under Morena since 2018. So if we had an autonomous institute for subsidy allocation in Mexico, this would not solve all of Mexican media's problems, but it would go a long way to solving many of the problems we've been talking about today.
Autonomous.
Well, you would look to models. You would take best practices from countries like the Netherlands and Norway.
Corrupt societies.
Well, it will be a challenge, yes.
But you managed to change things with IFE, which was the Federal Electoral Institute in the early 90s. And so,
yes, there are local precedents in the Federal Electoral Institute, in the Monopolist Commission. There are a number of institutions that were set up in the 90s and perfected since. Unfortunately, those institutions have come under attack in Mexico. You talk about democratic erosion. Jose, was it? Yeah, you talked about democratic erosion. I think you're quite right in that a number of the checks and balances upon federal power that were instituted in the 1990s at a time when Carlos Salinas was trying to convince Americans and Canadians that we really are democratizing. Those have been either reined in or even disappeared under Morena. So I don't think the kind of institute that I'm proposing is going to happen soon, but a future government could implement one.
Deborah, do we have 1 minute to pass that to Javier, editor of El Siglo de Torreón and the person who really is there to talk about this with the closest knowledge?
You mean about how local press...
about the idea of sort of IFE, federal subsidies for regional newspapers and even local.
The idea is not, it's not wrong on principle, but it's just, I think in Mexico it would be unworkable. I mean, there would be any number of strings attached to those subsidies, and particularly now, Morena is not very fond of autonomous institutions defining what should be public policy. You know, they wanna control everything. Now, there used to be more separation between what the mayor and the governor and the president did, right? And many times presidents were not necessarily in sync with governors or mayors, or they respected each other's political autonomies. There was a story about the owner of El Siglo de Torreón way before my time. It's back in the 40s. He was a very prominent local journalist, also owner of a local newspaper. He was very close with President Miguel Alemán back in the 40s. They were very good friends. And President Miguel Alemán's compadre was the governor of Coahuila, the state where Torreón is at. And the governor and the owner of the newspaper were always butting heads, right? Because Don Antonio de Juan Bels, the owner of the newspaper, was always criticizing the governor for whatever, you know, anything. They didn't like each other very much. And the governor was always responding about, you know, he should be careful because accidents happen and one day something is going to happen to him. And one day the heat got, you know, the rhetoric got so heated up that Antonio de Juan Bels, the owner of the paper, Miguel Alemán came to Torreón on a visit. And Antonio de Juan Bels went to see him and he said, well, you know, Mr. President, you know, your compadre, the governor, I think his comments are getting a little bit out of hand. And the president says, well, what's he been saying? Well, he's been saying, you know, that something might happen to me if I'm not careful in what I publish, you know, but he's been saying it, you know, very, very often now. And the president said that, well, Don Antonio, the way that he told the story, the president replied, well, you know, Antonio, if I were you, I'd be very careful because my compadre is a man of his word, right? As a way of saying, you know, don't look at me, you know, just deal with your stuff. The problem with Mexico is that we've looked to the center to fix all of our problems. It's always not going to work out very well. So, you know, there are all sorts of political dynamics in place, is the point, that journalists have to contend with very different political forces.
People will be running off to class and to other things to say that when Paul's book was published, we asked him if he wanted to do a book event, and he said, no, I don't want to do an event focused on the book. I want to bring the dream team to talk about journalism. So in contemporary Mexico. So thank you so much for joining us. It's really been a fascinating conversation. Thank you, Paul, for bringing this idea to the Buffett Institute, and thank you to our audience for all being here. Thank you.